kiddo. You don't want to be late again, do you?
One chance. That is all you get to see that scene. Do you even remember it, kiddo? Good. Because there's no way to see the scene a second time. Hey all, Siege here, and today I want to get into something a bit different, but first, are you aware of this aspect of Warframe? Cool water flows, the moon behind a cloud. To the receptive mind, all things come in time. Sun at mid-heaven, sovereign above all, mind in firm action, commits without reflecting. Between sun and moon unfolds a winding path. Not by one way alone is mastery achieved. If you've made it to the War Within, this is the basis behind the alignment symbol shown with the choices we're asked to make in various quests. In fact, Teshin can even be heard reciting the beginning to this very passage during his duel with Era in the New War.
Call out, Dax.
Cool water flows, the moon behind a cloud.
In the past, I personally speculated this to be associated with Carl Jung's concept of individuation, and based on what is presented here, I feel like that is still largely true, although a little later in the video I will reveal the inspiration for it, which, if you understand this stuff, you'll know the parallel nature of both concepts together. Further, I believe it's insinuated that a kind of balance is the key, but not in every scenario. More balanced in the grander sense, allowing each choice to be considered and thus adapting to the situation at hand versus having blind devotion to any one dogmatic premise. Teshin actually goes on to add a bit of additional context at the end of the passage as he writes, "Let me explain, child. The words I speak to you have purpose. The choices you've been forced to make have not attuned you to good nor evil, but to older, less subjective principles. You must find comfort in your choices, for your enemies will provide you none. The road ahead will be one that requires more choices of you. Child, be ready." These are the very words the Tenno were instructed with when being taught at the schools presented during the Second Dream.
And so you became Tenno, serving the Orokin, but bound by honor. As the Tenno grew, they founded great schools, the Tenno ways. Do you see yours?
An interesting concept in its own right. After the children would have been tamed to some degree following the Zerman Void jump accident and subsequent return, they were to be instructed in schools that aligned with their overall mindset. Branching off into 5 different disciplines, each could attune their void powers through and most likely maximize its efficiency due to the natural connection the students would have with their associated specialties. They are described as such. The path of engaging the enemy, their swift, uncompromising onslaught, holding nothing back and recklessly attacking their foes, could vanquish an opponent before he had the chance to steel himself. Speed and savagery characterized this school.
I see a cloud, a gathering storm, the Madurai way. Our path was to engage the enemy, to sweep across our foes before they had a chance to steel themselves.
Clearly, these Tenno were the most confident or potentially most driven of the group, preferring striking first and asking questions later, in an attempt to put the enemy down before they even had the chance to understand the threat they faced, throwing caution to the wind in caring what the enemy may have in store for them. For those that may have considered these misgivings, they were deemed unworthy of typical consideration, and the Tenno were willing to prove again and again the stout and perhaps even overzealous mindset that they each had was indeed more than enough for any adversary they would face. The school of Vazarin had a fairly different philosophy. They trained to counter the enemy and move with an opponent's attacks in order to nullify them. They maintained constant awareness in order to defend against all aggression. It's interesting because this mindset is one I know myself quite well, being a student of the ideas and teachings of the great Bruce Lee. In fact, I would very much associate this thought process with something Lee himself said in 1971 that matches up very much with this mindset and the Tao of Jeet Kune Do itself. Be formless, shapeless like water. You put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend. Now, what does this mean? Well, water is malleable and thus can fill any space easily. It adapts to whatever it comes into contact with. If it's in a cup, it becomes cup-shaped. Same thing with the form of the teapot. The purpose is that it can flow with any situation, and for the focus of the Vazarin school, uses the aggressing power of their adversary to their own advantage by moving with them in the very current of the battle itself, be it physical or mental, no matter what they might encounter. In this thought process, no enemy can win because it is with their own force that they will be undone. Water itself is considered soft to the touch, and yet, on a long enough timeline, it can penetrate rock, forming incredible valleys amongst the strongest of mountains. And wouldn't you know it, even the Tenno associates this discipline with some pretty compatible imagery.
I see a cresting wave. Wide in the ocean, the Vazarin way, we were trained to counter the enemy and move with an opponent's attacks in order to nullify them.
Vazarin's way is very much about taking the power of the opponent and using it against them by flowing with the moment, not anticipating the result of the altercation, rather embracing the now itself in a kind of lethal dance with their enemy, one they had no idea was awaiting their hostility. The third school, known as Neramon, is described as a discipline focused on knowing the enemy.
I see a tree of many branches, the Neramon way, our discipline focused on knowing the enemy. We believed that to truly understand a foe would confer the greatest advantage upon a warrior.
It is represented by the many-branching tree and is known for its intellectual assault. Strategists on the battlefield who believed and proved in many ways that knowing thine enemy through and through was the most straightforward path to success. Like the branches and roots of an immovable redwood, this strategy of understanding the oppressor and its weaknesses was a completely encapsulating method of attack, showing great wisdom and restraint in waiting and learning as much as possible about the enemy. From the root to the leaf, if you will. Everything. Perhaps even knowing more of them than what the enemy knows of itself, and providing maybe the greatest advantage any combatant can have on a battlefield with tactics that may even border the concept of premonition, in the eyes of the adversary at least. A truly formidable opponent to never be taken lightly. Students of Yunaru can be thought of as the living mountains. Tenno who, instead of tactics, honed themselves to withstand whatever the enemy might think it could throw at them. The Yunaru discipline is described as such. They pushed themselves to outlast the enemy, to withstand all aggression without retreat. They believed that if the enemy could not match their endurance, then a battle could be won without having even commenced. Even within the Tenno's own words, we can see this same sentiment.
I see a mountain, breaking the sky, the way of Yuneru. We pushed ourselves to outlast the enemy, to withstand all aggression without bending.
And to me, this group is the first to really embrace the superhero, or perhaps omniscient aspect of the Tenno, in this mindset at least. They knew their enemies could do nothing against them, not relying on strategy, intellect, or honing martial prowess, because Let's be real, all of these are, let's say, poor substitutes for just generally being the only invincible thing on the map. If there is no weakness to exploit, what then? I would consider this group the most stoic of the disciplines as well, the most emotionally stable, because while an impenetrable body is enticing, an impenetrable mind, perhaps say even in concert, would make the living mountain reference truly live up to its name. It will be here for as long as it desires, no matter the feelings of the adversary. Both devastating and demoralizing, I imagine only the most grounded of Tenno could truly master both forms. But if they did, that's a powerful mix. The disciples of Zenric are the fortunate souls blessed with the understanding of sheer endurance, clipping an opponent where they are vulnerable and overwhelming them to the point where they not only retreat, but many times lose the taste for battle altogether. Zenric Tenno can just keep going, like the Energizer Bunny, with the length and depth of their ambition near limitless, at the same time seeking to rob their opponent's zeal in the process, demoralizing them fully by both the visualization of a combatant that never seems to lose their one more round mentality, as well as a kind of anxiety born of the realization of their own stores, be it physical, mental, or spiritual, drained before their very eyes. This kind of desperation typically leads to frantic action and thus mistakes. The school itself boasts the mantra that they believed the clearest path to victory was to dominate the enemy. They sought to choke an opponent of all resources, that sheer strength could erase any resistance. The Tenno actually speaks of the nourishing power, a very specific and relevant aspect of the lore as well.
I see a crystal, refracting the moonlight. The way of Zenric. We believed the path to victory was to dominate the enemy. That strength of spirit could overcome any resistance.
Insinuating in many ways, those with a mastery of Zenric may in fact be literally acting as a living conduit to the most peculiar aspects of the moon, a place we come to learn has a very special connection with the void, and as such was exploited for quite a few of the Orcan elite's most nefarious pursuits. These Tenno can be said to share a different kind of relationship with the void, perhaps even bordering on being considered to belong, whether they know it or not, to a type of void priesthood in their own rights, the warlocks of the Warframe universe. And much of this is never really explained in game, so I have to ask, knowing all this now, would you choose differently in your first playthrough of the Second Dream? Where you originally select this? If you could, of course. You can change many things during the ending dialogue of this most monumental of quests should you decide to replay it. But your Tenno's school, the one your operator initially chooses, is not one of them. So why do I bring this up? Well, first I felt it interesting to go into a bit of the concepts behind the focus schools we choose to move between. And I wonder if that choice was given to the Tenno during the days of the Old War. The Orcan appeared to very much limit what those around them, peasant and warrior alike, were allowed to do and not do within the regime. And I wonder if our current ability to move between schools in order to have a total mastery of all was itself frowned upon, much in the way the Second Dream locks it, showing another way their powers may have been limited, something the Orcan clearly sought to do. While Teshin states that mastery can't be achieved in one way alone, I wonder if that's in reference to the different schools, or multiple paths that must be completed in order to achieve total mastery of the school in question. In truth, the original concept of housing the Tenno in cryopods to contain their powers and make them forget certain things,
This will stop the voices from taking hold. You will have to dream, my angel.
as well as Teshin's subsequent disapproval of such means during the War Within.
What happened to you?
They gave up.
You betrayed me. You infested piece of...
Yes, do it. As I thought. The hard way, then.
So, the great Teshin is just a dog, fetching the queen's stick wherever she throws it.
I warned you. Now you're trapped inside this place with the queens burrowing in. Now I am forced to undo what Margulis did, to open the gates, and make you suffer. Margulis lied to you, a lie of omission. She did not cure the Zariman children. She erased them. My only hope is that truth still lingers inside you, buried within your mind. The power and the misery of the void.
Well, it got me to thinking about choice in the game. And if the Tenno in the past were given a choice to go into these pods, or were they forced in? And even if they could have chose against it, would they have been forced in anyhow?
It's about the other rejects we consigned to Lua a few years ago. They're calling it transference. I know we are desperate, Executor, but these aren't Dark soldiers. These are golems possessed by devil minds. What they need, Margulis, is to be destroyed. They're devils from that hell, not human anymore.
How about you? If you could choose differently, especially in a way that's meaningful within the game itself, would you do it? All those choices, who we are now, what we said, the influences of our alignment, they are all set in stone, at least at this point. Without the influence of new quests, of course. And it just comes back to the concept that if you could go and do it all again without all the excessive grind, would you do it? I know I would. And finally, we come to the purpose of this video. I have a very strong desire for the ability to create a second character. Now, I know this is already technically possible, but I'm talking in a bit different manner than just making a new account and essentially starting from scratch, because invariably, I believe one of those Tenno is going to be left to rot at some point. You all know this to be true. This is a topic I've been wanting to speak about for quite a while, but in a recent stream, many within my community seemed to agree with what I was proposing there, so I figured it was maybe something to put out in a full video as well. What I'd love, and I'm guessing I'm not alone here, would be the ability to create a second character with access to the entirety of your first character's loadout. For lack of a better term, a New Game Plus, if you will, but with the benefit of full access to your former character as well. Maybe even being able to switch on the fly in some method as the Hex's new emotes allow. Who knows? For those of us who value the lore and the story of the game, but also for those who just love Warframe and one or another reason to play, I feel this would provide a very interesting incentive to start over, but not quite. Mods, frames, heck, even our Railjack is the Rising Tide quest associated with receiving it is already replayable without collecting a new one, so, that roadblock's already out of the way. Now, some of you, I'm certain, are asking, well, what's the point? And that would actually go twofold. The first, and I'm guessing the one most in the community would immediately gravitate towards, would be to potentially have another character for fashion purposes. Especially if it's the other gender, but I don't know, maybe you want 2 males or 2 females, sisters or brothers, not in blood, but in bond. Which is why they wouldn't have a problem sharing stuff, right? We actually learned in dialogue we received after the Hex quest that our Drifter had a sibling, so maybe even in blood. That, of course, would be up to your own headcanon and imagination, but I think it's important to remember that these choices that were offered during that section appear to allow each player to kind of customize their own backstory, with certain choices actually directly contradicting themselves, forcing a kind of eternalistic setup in this fine detail of the narrative. Otherwise, the Drifter is essentially an extremely unreliable source of guaranteed information. But I believe with each of our characters, this is, well, it's their journey. Something I think the quest choices have already been largely insinuating along the Tenno's path up to this point. And it's here that I have to wonder how many of you would have made different choices, especially now that you have a better understanding of things, a more educated take on the typical, but not always, three-choice model, and what we know it does, and even with what we believe. Because there is a reason for this thing. Within the game itself, the war within, the glass gambit, the sacrifice, whispers in the walls, and the hex have dialogue choices that will influence this alignment symbol, with three major states of mind, and these are based on the Eastern concepts of the yin and yang. And while not being a perfect summation in any way, can largely be thought of as a kind of continuous struggle between chaos and order. This might be a little confusing because of the connotation each have been associated with in the day-to-day function of our society, with chaos often aligning with destruction or even evil itself, and order typically associated with righteous and the morally good. But in actuality, it's far more gray in nature. Life itself is born of chaos, while order, especially when wielded by a particularly oppressive force, can be thought of and has been heavily linked with the negative. So it's probably safer to view these ideas more in the lines of forces of nature than actual ideology. We can even see this with many of the Tenno's decisions. The light versus darkness dial doesn't necessarily coordinate with what most would deem appropriate.
Squirm! Like the maggot you are!
And thus, we can really allow ourselves to dig into the very gray nature of the Tenno, and which aspect of the aforementioned litany of the Dax they have come to conduct themselves by. But now, memory loss, new circumstances, and, well, you controlling them has made their actions your choice. And for some of you out there, maybe you've only realized this or didn't pay attention to it much during the first playthrough and would like a second chances even in the quests you can replay. These are, unfortunately, all fixed to your initial decision. Another Tenno, though, would give us a kind of eternalistic second chance at all of it, right? Totally within the context of the lore. Well, mostly. But it would also provide each of us a kind of passive reason to farm older mods we never got, especially if some have become more desirable recently, due to weapon or probably more relevant companion changes within the game. But at the end of the day, it's really up to you on the why of creating a second character. Now, me personally, I want the ability to go back and play the quests that aren't currently replayable. Amongst the main narrative of Warframe, Vor's Prize, The Heart of Deimos, the Duviri Paradox, Angels of the Zariman, and the Chimera Prologue, a small section of the Prelude to War, as well as the Lotus Eaters, the last two obviously being very short and more cinematic in nature, but still offering a level of gameplay, are, at the making of this video, unable to be replayed in any capacity. And that's just from the main narrative. Mask of the Revenant, Hidden Messages, the Glass Gambit, the Limbo Theorem, and Veilbreaker all cannot be replayed, and while they are more minor in nature, there are still some pretty important aspects to the overall world building of the game within a great many of them. Aside from most likely missing out on countless lore aspects during each of these quests, as typically the player is more concerned with combat than paying attention to the implications of what characters are talking about and potentially revealing, and only being able to play through these one time really does make it difficult to enjoy the writing and storytelling that's going on. Sure, one can go to YouTube and watch it to get this information, but call me crazy, I enjoy playing the game. And a second time through even, especially with how someone running a second character would almost assuredly be more versed in the game's nuances during Try 2, and thus would be able to most certainly enjoy the dialogue a bit more, as they could actually pay attention to it. And considering the choices that we've already made, this time we can decide to have an entirely different story if we want. As mentioned previously, the newer dialogue offered after the Hex quest from the Drifter seems to allow us to choose our own adventure by mapping out our own backstory, for lack of a better term. And given some of the choices offered in the Second Dream and the War Within, maybe this is something that's been happening longer than I realized. I mean, certainly my conspiracy theory brain, yeah, the one you come here for, I get it. You like the crazy, with enough truth to make you think. It's an acquired taste, certainly, but you get me, and if you get me, you know I've thought about some of these differences in the past, but I just had always assumed they'd be loosely tied together in some way later down the road. But here, it's just so blatant that it really can't be ignored. And without the stress of worrying about the right loadout, or getting killed, or even failing missions, as this other Tenno would have access to the original's arsenal, well, it just seems like you could focus more so on the story. Which, this story is that good and should be focused upon. Now, if you want to put some kind of restriction on this, perhaps the Tenno is forced to adhere to the mastery rank as far as weapons and such are concerned. Because in the end, the goal isn't to punish the player, rather reward them. Maybe this would only be available to individuals who hit a certain mastery rank, or if nothing else, complete all of the available story content. And I could see that as a nice free carrot on a stick to keep people playing and reaching whatever milestone DE made this available for. What's more, there are some parts, very important parts sometimes of the quests, that can be replayed that unfortunately are taken out, such as the encounter with the Indifference on our orbiter just before we craft Entrati's Curio or during the Rising Tide quest. When we are shown our other on the top of the reliquary drive. Why these parts are missing is admittedly something I've always wondered, but I just assume it had something to do with technical limitations and how the mission itself was built. And I mean, I can totally sympathize, but I still can't actually play those quests and others and receive their full context. Now don't get me wrong, I get there would be some potentially substantial limitations for DE themselves here. And whilst I am ignorant to what exactly would need to be done, I'm not ignorant enough to understand that this would probably require a fair bit of work and maybe even some real creative thought behind the scenes. But a small change in the story structure I postulated in an earlier video could potentially work. Essentially starting your character in Duviri. It would be the first mission. You could create your Tenno right then and there. And because you'd have access to everything from your previous character, aside from story-related items and such, you'd be good to go. It might be a little awkward, especially up to the second dream, but people doing this would already know what's going on, and in some cases might even be skipping through parts of the story or even certain quests they really don't want to do again. Brave Rider. Sorry. And now, well, they wouldn't have to. Heck, they wouldn't really have to do anything they didn't want to. But every second of playtime is additional time that both the player is obviously enjoying, even though they've done it before, and DE is reaping the benefits of. Maybe even making some additional money on cosmetics and the like that didn't fit the vibe of the first Tenno, but this one, well, they need it. But what do you think? Would you take advantage of something like this, especially if you've pretty much been through the majority of the game's content? Perhaps I'm more of a niche player in that I do a fair bit of collecting, looting, and generally looking for the weapons, companions, vehicles, and such that suit the way I want to play, but I'm certainly not a completionist by any extent, so there are quite a few things, minor as they may be, that I could go back and potentially get on my second time through. Not to mention Soma chord fragments and the like, and of course my favorite part, the story. So this is such a slam dunk for a player like me that I would literally grind to whatever mastery rank was needed to be able to use this second character, with the obvious benefit of being essentially invincible in the process, and a true god in Warframe. At least through the quests and the initial star chart, of course. Maybe that could even be its title. True God Mode. What do you think? Would you be excited for something like this? It'd be fun to have two Tenno, wouldn't it? With that being said, I hope you all enjoyed today's video and it got you thinking about the choices you didn't get to make the first time around. Eternalism says we can go back and change the frame. Will DE ever allow it? Guess we'll find out. At any rate, I hope you all have a wonderful day today, a wonderful rest of your week. I'll talk at you all in the next one. Take care, everybody. Bye.